تطور تكنولوجي مذهل من أجل مركز متقدم بين الأمم، واقع انعكست تأثيراته على تفاصيل البشرية بأسرها. مع دوران عقارب الساعة تتقدم التكنولوجيا، تتنامى التحديات التي يسعى العقل البشري إلى تسخيرها. فالطريق إلى الريادة يتطلب مجاراة روح العصر.
في حالة عدم اليقين اللي يعيشه العالم اليوم والتحديات اللي نواجهها، أصبح استشراف المستقبل من ضمن أولويات الحكومات ومن المهارات المهمة للقيادات الحكومية. حكومة الإمارات في عام 2016 أطلقت استراتيجية استشراف المستقبل اللي تهدف لاغتنام الفرص في مختلف القطاعات، سواء كان في الطاقة والنقل، في الأمن والغذاء، وفي التعليم والصحة. أصبحنا اليوم نستشرف مستقبل هذه القطاعات على مستوى الدولة.
I think we're living in an age where technology is increasingly accelerating the work we typically do in the human society. Probably we can define work, in my opinion, in two categories. I'll define it by a question. Do we live to work or do we work to live? When you think about our work every day, it feels to me too often and too many of us are doing work that is repetitive, robotic, and highly specialized. I think in that sense, people who occupy such jobs need to be concerned about the future where artificial intelligence, machine learning can begin to quickly replace such work we typically do.
القيادة الرقمية في تصوري يجب أن تمتلك عقلية نقدر نقول عنها منفتحة ومتسائلة، inquisitive mindset. القيادة الرقمية هي اللي تعمل لتأهيل المواهب لديها وإكسابهم بالمهارات الرقمية المتقدمة والمتطورة.
We're looking for developers, coders, scientists, engineers to come here to be knowledge workers, to help us create a knowledge-based economy here in the UAE. We are in the knowledge field, as I mentioned earlier, more of a creative field. That job, for now, is more secure than the more repetitive robotic work we do.
تشير التقديرات والإحصاءات أن الذكاء الاصطناعي يمكن أن يساهم ب 14% في الناتج المحلي لدولة الإمارات أو في الاقتصاد الإماراتي بحلول عام 2030، أو ما يعادل 96 مليار دولار. الإمارات كانت من أول الدول في العالم في الإعلان عن استراتيجية الذكاء الاصطناعي في عام 2017 وخلق منظومة تجذب المواهب العالمية والشركات الناشئة والشركات الكبرى للتواجد في دولة الإمارات.
I think the role we have to play now as humans is to think ahead of these machines. On one hand, we are training the machines, we're supervising them. We're making them better and better at assisting us, helping us, doing work for us, even replacing things that we do today we don't want to do anymore. But eventually, this tool we invented called artificial intelligence may catch up with us. AI will eventually have the smarts, the intelligence to be able to think on its own. And in that case, we'll be faced with real competition to even be challenged in the field of creativity.
كذلك من ضمن التحديات المهمة هي موائمة التشريعات والسياسات والقوانين للتغيرات التكنولوجية المتسارعة وللتحديات اللي نواجهها. مثلا نحن الآن بحاجة إلى تشريعات وقوانين للذكاء الاصطناعي المسؤول Responsible AI اللي ما فيه تحيز، العادل ويركز على الإنسان.
I think the key is to stay ahead of our own invention. the invention of artificial intelligence, we understand where AI is going. We continue to find out new purposes for us humans.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. صاحب السمو الشيخ محمد بن زايد آل نهيان، ولي عهد أبو ظبي، نائب القائد الأعلى للقوات المسلحة، سمو الشيوخ، أصحاب المعالي والسعادة، الضيوف الكرام، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. اسمحوا لي بداية بالتعريف عن نفسي. معاكم خليفة القامة، مدير إدارة المختبرات في مؤسسة دبي للمستقبل. يسرني أن أقدم متحدثنا اليوم الأستاذ سليم إسماعيل، باحث وكاتب ومؤسس شركة إكس ووركس. في مجلس اليوم يحدثنا الأستاذ إسماعيل عن سر نجاح المؤسسات المتسارعة النمو، وبالأخص بيئة عملها، وكيف يمكن لنا الاستفادة من هذه الخبرات. نلفت عنايتكم بأن المحاضرة ستكون باللغة الإنجليزية، وبإمكانكم استخدام السماعات لمتابعة الترجمة الفورية. اسمحوا لي الآن بأن أكمل حديثي باللغة الإنجليزية. Your Highnesses, Your Excellencies, honored guests, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Salim Ismail, who is the author of Exponential Organizations, a global bestseller on how to scale organizations as fast as technology scales. He is a business and technology strategist to some of the largest companies in the world. Salim was the founding executive director of Singularity University, and before that he had the innovation at Yahoo. Currently, Salim serves on the board of X Prize Foundation. He has a degree in theoretical physics and lives currently in Miami. Please join me in welcoming Salim to begin his lecture.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone, and Ramadan Kareem to all of you. Thank you for being here. I'm going to talk through what we see happening in the world and give you some basis for some of the transformation that is happening. But most importantly, I would like to touch on how do you react? How do you adapt to this new world? We can see that the world is changing very dramatically in front of us. And we can see with the rise of the pandemic how volatile that change is. We are seeing the biggest shift in humanity maybe in our entire history. And so how do we deal with that? And I'll start with this orange graph that was put together by Ray Kurzweil. He looked at Moore's law, the idea that we double computational price performance. And he went back all the way to 1900, and he found that we have been doubling computational power for over 100 years, way before Gordon Moore made his predictions. And the question that he asked when he saw this data and this curve is, why is this curve so smooth and so predictable? You know, in the last 100 years, we've seen wars and recessions and ups and downs in the industry. You should expect a very jagged stock market type shape. And yet we see this very predictable, steady progression, and it doesn't make sense. And Ray spent 10 years researching this and came up with a fundamental observation, which is once you take a domain, a discipline, a technology, a product area, and you power it with information technologies, and it acquires informational flow properties, the price performance starts doubling. Most importantly, and which is very hard for us to understand, once that doubling pattern starts, it does not stop. It just keeps going. And the reason is, even though in computation we've had multiple technologies like vacuum tubes and relays and transistors and integrated circuits, as we reach the upper limit of one technology, if you have an information-based environment, something else always takes over the curve. So we're actually now reaching the end of the life cycle of integrated circuits. The chips are getting very hot down at the surface levels. We're down to 2 to 4 nanometers of wire thickness. But now we have a cluster of technologies at the edge ready to take it to the next level: optical computing, 3D chip design, quantum computing, which requires a lot of explanation, so I won't get into it here. But suffice it to say, we're entering a world where we have infinite computation, infinite storage. And that paradigm is now permeating all of other technologies and all our industries. And it led Peter Diamandis to write this book called Abundance, charting out that as we employ technology in all of these different areas, we're moving from scarcity to abundance in a whole series of areas like education, clean water, healthcare, energy, in about a decade or so. And what does that world look like? And a fundamental property of technology is it takes something that is scarce and it makes it abundant. That's a fundamental nature of this. And now we have a dozen technologies moving very quickly. Peter is the founder of the X Prize Foundation, which many of you are familiar with, which we give large public prizes wherever there are market failures. I joined the board a few years ago, which has some interesting characters on it. Every board meeting starts with, what did Elon Musk just do? And then we move on to the rest of the business of the day. The reason this foundation is powerful is we found that when we offer a $10 million prize, about 15 times that amount is spent on R&D. So the SpaceX prize that was won, we raised a $10 million prize, but $150 million was spent by all of the collective teams trying to win the prize. And now we have a $2 trillion space industry that didn't exist before. So we deploy prizes wherever we see market failures and governments aren't doing enough. You've heard my background. Really, my experience at Yahoo was fundamental and is driving a lot of my thinking today. I was the head of innovation there, and I learned a fundamental lesson, which is when you try anything disruptive in a large organization, the immune system attacks you. Because all of our organizations are built to resist change and withstand risk. And how do you juxtapose that with disruptive innovation is a very difficult problem. And every large organization in the world has struggles with this. And we've been working on that tool set, and it's partly what led to the book. The challenge when we have exponential growth, as we now see, is that our brains cognitively don't see this. All of our education, training, intuition about the world teaches us linear extrapolation, right? One of the reasons I'm so excited about the Emirates is that you have here an environment where you train on 10x, 100x growth. And that I find fascinating, because if you can keep that mindset, then you leapfrog past everybody else, and you, of course, have a history of doing this. The magic of technology today is that we now have a dozen technologies operating on this doubling pattern. And this is something completely unique in human history. At any time, we maybe had one technology accelerating or another. We've never had this many technologies move this aggressively all at the same time. Drones, for example, are doubling every 9 months in their price performance. The speed at which we can image the human brain is doubling every year. And so if you layer a solution on that technology, the solution scales along with the same underlying doubling pattern, which is why we're seeing so much disruption today. And all of that added together is leading to kind of 4 major dynamics in the world, right? The first is pretty obvious. We're digitizing the world very rapidly. Our memories aren't in our heads now, they're in our smartphones. All our relationships are digital, all our communications are digital. It turns out when you digitize, things become very disruptive. And the best metaphor we've seen for this is photography. Some of you may be old enough to remember film photography. You're operating on a scarcity model, on a material chemical image on a film, right? And you operate from that scarcity model. And a whole bunch of business models occur around that. When you move to digital photography, you have 3 very interesting things happen. First, marginal cost goes to 0, which is fascinating. Now I can take 1,000 photographs and the cost doesn't change. As a result of that, the domain completely explodes. Today we're holding the button down on all of our devices and taking literally billions of times more photographs than we did before. The third thing that happens that's very subtle, but very important, especially from a business context, is you change the problem space. In film photography, the big problem is how do I take the best photograph, because it costs a few dirhams to process the film and to pay for the processing cost. Right? And we have expensive cameras. We offer courses on photography. We publish books on composition to help people with that scarcity. Then you move to digital scarcity and all those problems disappear, all those business models disappear. And now the challenge we have in photography is that I have 8 copies of my photographs on 10 different services and I can't find anything. And you've gone from a sourcing problem to a filtering problem. Most importantly, all of those old business models completely gone. And so we see as we digitize, we need completely new business models to operate in this new world. Subscription models, freemium models, advertising models, and so on. We're seeing this transition happen in all of these technologies, and now addressing industry after industry, going from scarcity to abundance. And the reason that this happens is when you have an information-based environment, you can apply artificial intelligence and computation and modeling and simulation and so on. Right? I spent a few minutes at ADNOC earlier, and just the data visualization of what's happening is absolutely profound to see. So this is now applying lots of domains. I'll touch on one just as an example, vertical farming. We have enormous, this is now crossing over. We've now turned agriculture into a technology. And now the price performance is doubling very rapidly. It is now crossing over into complete viability. The best calculation we have seen is that if you took 35 skyscrapers in Manhattan and turned them into vertical farms, that would feed the entire city sustainably. So when we think about food security, et cetera, instead of doing millions of hectares of horizontal farming all around the world, we can do this and radically change the equation. And we have much more resilience in our global systems as a result. And by the way, when you do vertical farming, you save 99% of the water. And about 70% of our fresh water is used for agriculture today. So this is extraordinarily promising for regions like the Middle East. This is our old way of doing vertical farming, right? This is obviously very difficult and should be avoided if at all possible. But here's a recent example which I'm fascinated by. This is a farming system in Australia where they're using solar energy to desalinate water, and then they grow plants and so on. They're making 17,000 tons of tomatoes a year with zero energy cost, because they can use a circular system to do it. And this is the kind of thing that is now incredibly possible all over the world. So I tried to live all this myself. We have lots of great examples around this. I took a Tesla a few years ago and I drove from Toronto to Miami. And I would stop at the charging stations, and when I drove it up, the car drove itself about 35% of the time. I would stop, I would hit the button for autonomous driving mode and so on. Then something interesting happened. 18 months later, I drove it back. And I was slightly more clever on the trip back, a couple of less stops. But if you look at that bottom row, that becomes really interesting. Because when I drove it up, the car drove itself about 35% of the time. When I drove it back 18 months later, same car, same sensors, is now driving itself 80% of the time. And that's just better data, better analytics. That many more cars have mapped the roads. That's actually Moore's law in live action. Right? And that's a profound thing. And there's something deeper that's going on, which is that if you think about it, I got into this vehicle, which is basically a first-class train cabin. It carried me across the country 80% of the time by itself. And because the charging stations are free for that model of car that I had, the entire trip, 2,500 kilometers, cost me zero. It was free, right? When we go back and forth and I say to my wife, you fly, I'll take the car. And this is a fascinating distinction. And I call that a Gutenberg moment. In the 15th century, the printing press arrived and fundamentally changed the world by democratizing the ability to print. And now we have literature as we know today. Well, solar energy is a Gutenberg moment, right? Artificial intelligence changes the world. Blockchain changes the world completely. CRISPR, we have about 20 Gutenberg moments hitting us at the same time today. And we've never seen this before, all at the same time. Typically, we see about 1 per century, and we have all of this happening today. This is causing today enormous disruption to our institutions. Right? Democracy is designed to make decisions over a long period of time to give the population time to vote and understand what's happening and make the right decision. Well, we need to make decisions very fast today, and democracies, the metabolism of a democracy does not fit. So every major democracy in the world today is under stress. My family was very involved in the Indian independence movement. Well, India as a democracy is a mess. Brazil is a mess. Right? The UK broke 3 years ago. The US is breaking in front of our eyes right now. And how do you update that? How do you fix that? We see the same thing with fiat currencies and crypto. The best example I've seen of institutional disruption is marriage. It turns out we invented marriage as a social institution about 9,000 years ago. Well, 9,000 years ago, average lifespan was about 23 years old. So back then, you got married and you had kids and you died. Marriage is not designed to last 50, 60, 70 years. Right? We worry about the divorce rate and the stress in marriages, but it was invented at a time that doesn't exist anymore. We are about to double human lifespan in the next decade or so. How do you evolve a marriage and the relationship in that institution when the lifespan is that long compared to when it was designed? And we see this type of stress in all of these systems. And this is an enormous stress. It's also an enormous opportunity, because anybody who can understand how we design our systems and our institutions for the future will lead the world. And one of the things I'm so excited by hearing is the way that the UAE and the Emirates and the region in general is designing institutions for the future. Right? It's fascinating to see. On the economic side, we're having this enormous demonetization happen, because something that is unique today is that in the history of mankind, new technologies always cost a lot. And only a government lab or a big corporate lab could afford to do new products and services. Today, for the first time in human history, advanced technologies are very cheap. The blockchain is open source and free. And it allows anybody to innovate now in an incredibly powerful way. DNA sequencing, the price is crashing. Solar energy, the price is crashing. The price of sensors, drones, etc., are all dropping dramatically. When we had the space shuttle, it cost about $600 million per launch of the space shuttle. SpaceX, 15 years later, has dropped that by 10 times at $60 million for a launch of a SpaceX rocket. And this is Revolution Space. They 3D print the rocket engines, and they're going to bring it down to $6 million. So that's 100 times drop in cost over a 25-year period, which means unbelievable explosion in that space. Much more testing and so on can go on. There are lots of dimensions around this. I encourage you to read this book called The Price of Tomorrow. When we had our fiat monetary systems get created, they didn't realize that technology was deflationary, and hence the stress in the world today. And crypto, Bitcoin, blockchain are essentially a hedge against the difficulties faced by fiat systems. Right? We have this now, and I said before, the challenge is that we are not seeing this very clearly. If you are in an existing industry, you don't see disruptive change. When the Tesla first came out, the entire car industry ignored it, right? And we see how that works. This graph is maybe my favorite to describe this. What you see in the black there is the actual growth of solar energy, right? Complete exploding up into the right. The colored lines represent the predictions of the top energy experts in the world as to the future of solar energy. And what you see is every single point on this exponential curve, the expert goes linear. They cognitively cannot see this happening. Year after year, solar energy doubles in its price performance, and the top energy experts in the world go, yeah, it's going to level off now. And in 2018, they predicted it would go down. And how do you get there? And we find this, by the way, not to pick on the energy industry, we find this across domain after domain after domain. When you have exponential growth, the resident experts don't see it. It's their own kind of immune system around this, right? And this is now, all of this is leading to this most unbelievable democratization of innovation, where domain after domain, the information cost goes to zero. You get new products and services that disrupt the status quo. We have the Hyperloop, Elon Musk's one of his brainchilds, right? Going from incredible innovation in this kind of a model. To give you an example of the mindset, I was chatting with Elon about this. I said, Elon, if you want to, he wanted to go from LA to San Francisco in 20 minutes. At about 4,000 miles an hour. And I said to him, Elon, I have a degree in physics. If you accelerate a human being from 0 to 4,000 miles and then drop them back to 0 in 20 minutes, you're probably going to kill them. And his response was, yes, it's a problem, right? So I'm looking at it as a showstopper, because I would have stopped the project. And he's like, yeah, we have to overcome that problem. And that mindset is now being copied by tens of thousands of entrepreneurs that don't stop. They just keep going. And that is a fascinating possibility of what that makes available in the world today, right? By the way, the methodology used by Elon Musk is very simple. He takes a technology that's growing exponentially, looks out 10 years, where will that technology be in 10 years? And let's build a company to intercept that curve. That's it, whether it's neural links, batteries, et cetera, that's his model. And just to make sure you're clear that this is not a Silicon Valley concept, that this is now applicable anywhere in the world. Here is a fishing village in Vietnam. Once a month, a big ship would come carrying diesel fuel for their fishing boats. The ship stopped coming. They had no fuel for their fishing boats. They bought a solar panel, looked up the internet on how to connect it to their propeller, and literally invented a solar-powered boat. Here you have cutting-edge innovation using disruptive technology happening at the edge of the world. We get very excited when we see this. Because when they get their hands on drones and biotech and CRISPR, things will get very interesting. This is the third fastest electric supercar in the world, the third best performing electric supercar being designed, built, and engineered in Sri Lanka, that hotbed of automotive innovation. Right? I will suggest to you that if you can do this on an island of fishermen, you can do anything anywhere. Now it completely comes down to what mindset do you have when you embrace this innovation. Vitalik Buterin, 18 years old, middle-class kid growing up in Toronto, ignores his professors who said you can't do this type of a network, and boom, we have a $500 billion ecosystem in Ethereum out of nothing. So to summarize what's happening in the world, we have a massive influx of technology disruption. In domain after domain, we're going from scarcity to abundance. We have massive time compression. Things are happening unbelievably quickly. I think we stress a lot of our institutions around this, and clearly most of our leaders are not trained for this, especially in the US where I'm living these days. They're completely fighting this every inch of the way. And how do we deal with all of these is the key question. And from a company perspective, if you're running a business, this quote from Jack Welch really hit me. He said, if the metabolism of your company is slower than the outside world, you're dead. The only question is when. Right? In large companies, we have to increase the metabolism. Think about this idea. Almost all of the conversation in a big company is about what's happening inside the company. Very little is about what's happening outside the company. Right? And that impedance mismatch causes an enormous problem. And typically when you try anything disruptive in a big organization or a legacy environment, you get this kind of response. Right? I call this the immune system response. There's any number of reasons why you cannot do something. We're very bad in big organizations at saying yes to ideas in many cases. So we tried to deal with this and try to think about how do you apply this. And in the book that we wrote a few years ago, we cataloged the fastest growing companies in the world and teased out a set of characteristics, starting with a massive transformative purpose, 5 externalities like Uber not hiring its drivers, TED using community, Google using algorithms, and then 5 internal mechanisms like the lean startup methodology, real-time dashboards, decentralized organizations, et cetera, et cetera. Here's an example. This is Guazi, a Chinese used car company. If you think about used cars, it's not obvious how you would disrupt the used car market, right? Maybe you have a better app. Maybe you can pay for the car using an app, or have a system where the car is delivered to you. They actually show up at somebody that wants to sell the car. They take audio of the engine and they do machine learning on the engine so they can see if there's any problems in the engine. They do video and photographs, and they price the car in real time. Then they offer the seller 10% less, and they try and sell it for 10% more. This company is 7 years old. They have captured 80% of the Chinese used car market in 7 years. 80%. They sell 2 million cars a month. Right? So by applying these principles, you can blow open an existing company to unimaginable levels today in a way that was not conceivable. And we tried to apply this to big companies to see, does this apply to big companies? And we ranked the biggest companies in the world in the Fortune 100, the biggest companies in the US, by how flexible and adaptable was the organization. And we put out a ranking of this. And we tracked the top 10 and the bottom 10, which were the ones that used these adaptable structures the most and which ones used them the less. At the end of it, we did a result. We just did a 7-year trailing calculation and found that the top 10 most flexible, adaptable companies just in the Fortune 100 outperformed the bottom 10 by all those metrics. Most important, the bottom one, 40 times more shareholder return for between the top 10 and bottom 10. That is a staggering number, because as the external world becomes more volatile, your ability to adapt will drive market value. We now have a very clear metric that the more adaptable your organization, the more high-performing it will be. So as we think about the future, there are 3 major suggestions we have. Number 1, embrace disruptive innovation because it is the future. Incremental innovation is gone. You do that here and there. But disruptive innovation and the ability to embrace it and structure around it is incredibly important. Number 2, our organizations need to be structured for adaptability. And not just our companies, but our government departments, our NGOs, our impact projects, our institutions, etc. Right? And 3, and maybe most importantly, we need a mindset shift, because you need a totally different mindset for that. I'll give you this example on embracing disruptive innovation. Marriott Hotels is worth $53 billion today. If Marriott had launched TripAdvisor, Booking.com, Airbnb, their market cap would be 5 times higher than what it is today. And the reason I use this example is all of those ideas to launch Airbnb and a Booking.com were sitting inside Marriott. The immune system would not let them out because they were worried it would cannibalize the existing business. So the fear of protecting the existing business left that much on the table for other people to grab. Right? So this is the incredible mindset possible. We've been working on solving this problem, and we've open sourced a solution where we run a 10-week engagement in big companies to solve this immune system problem. We piloted this with Procter & Gamble, and we found a way of hacking culture at scale. We've done it 60 times in large organizations around the world, and we've open sourced it because we think every organization in the world needs to go through this. We've also created a nonprofit to do the same thing in the public sector. Because in the public sector, you have a more difficult immune system. Bankers are fighting Bitcoin, taxis are fighting Uber, and how do we get through that? So we've adapted the process. We've run it a number of times, most notably with the mayor of Miami. And a large part of the buzz around Miami is we laid down all the vocabulary around crypto and Bitcoin a few years ago. And so these are the mindsets I think we need to have for the future that all your people in your organizations should have. An abundance mindset, right? An exponential mindset, a moonshot mindset, and then an organizational mindset to take advantage of this. I'm going to leave you with 3 examples of what happens if you can take advantage of this. We launched at XPRIZE a few years ago a water abundance prize, which was, can you create a machine that will extract water molecules out of the air at a rate of 2,000 liters a day, which is enough for a village or an apartment building, using only renewable energy, and the cost has to be less than 2 cents a liter, right? So very aggressive. There are 1 million villages in the Himalayas, in the Andes, and mountains in Africa that could all use a machine like this to have clean water in all the towns in the desert. We launched this prize. We typically design prizes to last about 7 or 8 years to give teams time to form. 2 years into it, this team showed up and announced that they'd have a machine. We tested it. We awarded the prize. We can now deliver clean water anywhere in the world, and an amazing opportunity for the UAE would be to commercialize a technology like this and create an export industry that needs 1 million such machines around the world. Second example, I was meeting with the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka a year ago, and he told me that they were about to do a $500 million upgrade to the ports because the Colombo's grown a lot, etc. And they were spending a massive amount of money to upgrade the ports, borrowing the money to do this. And I said to him, listen, I did 2 calculations on the back of an envelope. I said, an average container weighs 10,000 kilos. A drone today can carry 600 kilos, but these drones are doubling every 9 months. So that means in 3 doublings, a drone can carry 600, 1,200, 2,400 kilos, and now you have 4 drones picking up the corner of a container. You don't even need a port. Right? So they're spending $500 million in putting the company into debt when they could just wait for the technology to catch up and basically and the operating cost of this is lower than a typical port. And there's another export industry that's hugely possible. And I'll end with this final example, which is this pad that's been developed with a company called Wellways. Those dots that you see on that pad are little nano temperature sensors. This is designed for detecting breast cancer. So if you're a woman, you put this on at home for 10 minutes, you take a picture of it, it does a very sensitive temperature measurement. It turns out this approach is 80% better at detecting breast cancer than a mammogram, costs about $20, and this is FDA approved. It's fully tested and live. We can eradicate breast cancer globally just by giving this out, right? But to do this, you need a different mindset. You have to fight the immune system in existing companies and our institutions and our healthcare systems and be able to get this out. And the challenge that I see for the world is we have all of these unbelievable breakthroughs, but an enormous social difficulty in getting them implemented. So I'd give you one suggestion as you think about how you go back to your organizations and what can you do. Amazon, about 10 years ago, recognized that in any large organization, it's very easy to say no to an idea. 1 of 20 people can say no to an idea, it kills the idea. So they came up with a policy. It's called the Amazon Institutional Yes. So if you come to me inside Amazon with an idea, I'm not allowed to say no. My default answer has to be yes. If I want to say no to your idea, I have to write a 2-page paper on why it's a bad idea and post it publicly for everybody else to read. So they've created friction and embarrassment to saying no, meaning that many more ideas get tried and tested all the way through. And this has completely changed the company. One of the results of this policy was Amazon Web Services. Nothing to do with their core strategy. Nobody could figure out how to say no to it. Amazon Web Services now delivers 75% of Amazon's profits globally, and it's one of the most successful products of all time. So a suggestion I would have for you as you go back to your teams is institute this idea inside your companies, your organizations, your government departments, and watch the result. Because when you stop people from saying no, all of a sudden you embrace possibility, right? I'm incredibly excited by what's happening in countries like the UAE because I see, I was just talking to Khalifa about how you evolve legal structures to be future focused. There are only 2 countries in the world that I think do future thinking properly. Singapore does it badly, you do it much better. Because almost all public policy globally is created defensively and reactively. And by doing it proactively and saying we know what the future looks like, let's intercept those curves, you create unbelievable possibility. And so thank you for having me. I hope you have a great iftar when you go back. It's been wonderful to be here, and Khalifa, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the fascinating talk, Salim. If I might maybe shed some light and ask you some questions about the great work that you've been doing. You've mentioned many of the companies that you've tracked were private companies, and this is great. So one might ask, how could you actually utilize this knowledge on the public realm or the public sector?
What we're finding is we now understand very well how to embrace these ideas in big companies. You do disruptive innovation at the edge, you break the immune system response, And if you see something succeeding at the edge, don't bring it back in, because it won't fit neatly. If it's truly disruptive, it won't fit properly, right? You spin it off or create a new, or let that become the new gravity center. Nestle spun off Nespresso, and it all absolutely exploded in success. But we're now seeing that same thing happen in public sector, where people are embracing these ideas. I was talking to the Minister of Oceans in Mauritius, and he was using this model to run this entire ministry. And we found about 30 countries around the world applying these ideas into public sector environments and government, because there, the natural massive purpose is to serve the citizenship and the citizenry, and that's a natural thing. And if you can add AI type thinking, community, some of the new organizational techniques, fundamentally what's happened is we've turned organizational design into a technology, right? And now it's scaling very quickly.
So great, you get the leaders on board, you start implementing the change. How do you go on tackling the risk or the risk aversion in organizations?
So, large organizations are designed for efficiency and for predictability, right? If you're Unilever, you're trying to deliver the same bar of soap in a million places around the world, or a McDonald's hamburger, which I think of as a 3D printed food, by the way. When you look at something like what's happening today, we need to be designed for adaptability, flexibility, agility, and speed. And you need to break that immune system. And what we're seeing big companies do is take on that massive purpose. So for example, Paul Pullman, the CEO of Unilever, ordered every brand after reading the book to take on an MTP. And now the 5 most profitable brands are the ones that are the most purpose-driven. Right? And so that's an enormous opportunity. And what happens is then you put the nature of the conversation of the company outside the company. How are we going to deliver this into the world? And that takes away a lot of the politics and solves a lot of that immune system problem.
That's fascinating. So if we go a bit deeper and one more layer in, what about the execution layer, the people that are on the ground? How should they change their behavior?
So this is where adaptability becomes very critical. In our past, the way we managed leadership is I would spend 10 years doing supply chain in BMW. I became really good at sourcing parts from different places in different countries. And my leadership depended on my intuition about how my domain worked, right? Well, today, because the world is changing so fast, the more experience you've had, the less useful you are. So now we need to be evidentiary-based. We need to run lots of experiments on a nonstop basis. And then on the basis of those experiments, you decide what to do. So I'll use Amazon again as an example. For every team inside Amazon, they ask the question, how many experiments did you run this quarter? How many succeeded? How many failed? If you're not running enough experiments and not enough are failing, your bonus gets challenged, because you want to be constantly learning. And this also brings about an enormous piece around disruptive innovation, is you have to be willing to fail, right? And because if you try something radical, your chances of failure go high. Because we can do aggressive R&D today at very low cost, we can now try radical things at very low cost. So the recommendation we have for large organizations is have a portfolio of small experiments running on the edge on a nonstop basis, and then you fund something once it starts to show success. And so you almost become like a venture capital portfolio as a large organization or as a large government department, right? And something I see with huge enthusiasm here, you're experimenting with government in a way that most people don't do.
That's great. Maybe because of time, we have one last question. From the time you've written the book, I'm sure you've had a lot of experiences implementing these ideas on the ground. If you'd write it again or revise it, what would you change?
What would I change about the book? I would stress the massive purpose a lot more. We found that it's absolutely central to organizations of the future. Secondly, I would have created an investment fund based on this thesis, because we would have made a lot of money if we'd invested on this structure in the past. The third thing would be to recognize organizational design now as a technology, because we're seeing a Cambrian explosion of organizational designs, DAOs, Web3, right? So for example, I'm incredibly excited about when you take typical organizational design and now you add crypto economics to it, and Web3 technologies like NFTs, which allow you to programmatically manage a large group of people, anything is possible. And I wish we had seen that and embraced that earlier. I just finished rewriting the second edition of the book because the rise of NFTs is completely changing the game. You take Ethereum, $500 billion, but many of the other blockchains are 20, 30, 40, $50 billion ecosystems just by managing crypto economics effectively.
Thank you. Thank you, Salim. I'd like to conclude our session today with 3 main takeaways. 1, technology is exponentially growing and is starting to converge. And that convergence is leading to a large number of innovations. Organizations and institutions are being disrupted because of this growth. And herein lies an opportunity for us to reorganize ourselves to harness this change instead of resisting it. And lastly, abundance, not scarcity, could be the way we solve the challenges of today and tomorrow. Now with that, I would like to extend my thanks to His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan for hosting this lecture, and to Mr. Salim Ismail for the plethora of insightful information, and as well as to our esteemed guests and audiences for their valuable time. Now, I would like to invite His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, Dr. Saeed, Mr. Ping, to honor the stage for a group photo. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.